So the mitzvah of the Korban Pesach of Paschal offering is mitzvah number 5, and it begins a series of commandments all relating to the Korban Pesach, presented as the first sacrifice being brought in Egypt. This is the night before their departure, and the details of that night were for them specifically, but many of the details were also incorporated into the commandment for a Pesach offering, a Korban Pesach forever, whether it be in temple times when we had a sacrifice, whether it be the matzah and the maror, whether it be the story. These are all parts of that experience of the what's called Pesach Mitzrayim, the Egyptian Passover, which transitioned into Pesach Ladoros, into the eternal Passover. But our specific focus is on the mitzvah of the Korban Pesach. We're going to look at the text of the Sefer HaChinuch, and we're going to, as we often do, jump into some other possible issues that will emerge. And so let's get underway. Source number 1 is Sefer HaChinuch, mitzvah number 5. It's the commandment to slaughter the Pesach sacrifice, to slaughter on the day of the 14th of Nisan in the late afternoon an unblemished 1-year-old male lamb or kid in the chosen house, Beis HaBechira, the temple. And this is called Pesach, the Passover sacrifice, as it is stated. The entire assembly of congregation of Israel shall slaughter it in the afternoon. The content of this commandment is that all the people of Israel divide into assemblages, take from the market or from their houses an unblemished 1-year-old male kid or lamb, and slaughter in the courtyard of the temple on the 14th day of Nisan in the afternoon. Afterwards, in the evening, they eat it, dividing it up amongst themselves after eating their other food, since its commandment is that it should be eaten while satiated. Right? The Paschal lamb was not the meal, it was the dessert, it was after eating. And is practiced by males and by females at the time of the temple. And one who transgresses it volitionally, meaning they know what they're doing, and does not offer the Pesach sacrifice, is liable for excision, is liable for kares. That is the punishment. So let's unpack some of the issues that are to be found here. One, we know that when we think of Pesach, we think of the Seder night. We see here that there is a major commandment, an essential commandment on the afternoon before Pesach night. Often we connect the Erev Pesach with the fast of the firstborn in the morning, burning of the chametz also in the morning. We don't think very much about what's taking place in the afternoon because we don't have anything in the afternoon. But this is a mitzvah of Erev Pesach afternoon. In fact, there is a custom that some have. You sometimes see it in the Pesach Machzor that at Mincha time, you should recite the order of the bringing of the Korban Pesach. There's the way the Mishnah and the Gemara describe the sacrifice being brought should be recited in the afternoon of Erev Pesach. So even though we don't have a sacrifice, we have some way of remembering what used to take place. It's not a very commonly practiced custom, but it's out there. And we see that this is, it's done in different groups. But this is it is the slaughtering of the Pesach sacrifice, which is the commandment. Just to draw attention to the end, the last sentence that we read, we know that the Sefer HaChinuch usually presents the commandment, presents the biblical sources of the commandment, references the details of the commandment and how it's done and where those details can be found. Remember, the Sefer HaChinuch isn't there to teach you what the procedures are. That's what the Mishnah is for. That's what the Code of Jewish Law is for. So the Sefer HaChinuch will tell you where in Jewish literature to find the details, where in the Talmud to find the details. Then the Sefer HaChinuch will tell us some of the rationale for the commandment. And we didn't go into the rationale here because when it comes to Passover, Pesach, the rationale is usually the same. We have to remember the Exodus from Egypt. Zecher Litzias Mitzrayim. It's one of the most essential principles, and we invoke the Exodus always. We invoke it at Friday Night Kiddush, and we invoke it in Shema. We invoke it all of the holidays. Everything goes back to the Exodus. So that's the philosophy, that's the rationale of all of these commandments relating to Pesach, the fact that we're remembering the Exodus. And then at the end of presenting the mitzvah, the Sefer HaChinuch tells us who's obligated, what happens when it goes wrong, and whether this is a commandment that can be fulfilled for all time or only during the times of the temple. And so the last sentence in source number 1, it is practiced by males and by females at the time of the temple. And one who transgresses it is liable for kares, excision. So let's just talk a little bit about this commandment. Pesach is a time-bound positive commandment. In the language of the Talmud, it's a mitzvahs aseh shehazman grama. And usually women are exempt from positive time-bound commandments. So for example, shofar and lulav, these are also positive time-bound commandments, and the Talmud exempts women from fulfilling them. And the question is, why are women obligated in the Paschal sacrifice? It's positive and time-bound. So a number of answers are suggested. I imagine some of you are thinking, an obvious one, how can women not be obligated in Pesach? Pesach is so foundational, so of course women are obligated. It's intuitive. The Talmud isn't always intuitive, so we need to dig a little bit more deeply. And one of the explanations that is given is that anytime a positive time-bound commandment is accompanied by negative commandments, then, as I like to explain it, if you're obligated in the don'ts, you're obligated in the do's. If you're obligated in the negative commandments, you're also obligated in the positive commandments. And Pesach has a lot of negative commandments. Don't eat chametz. So if you're obligated in don't eat chametz, then you also have to eat matzah. If you're obligated in the negatives relating to Pesach, you also have to bring the Korban Pesach. Now, it says very clearly here, this is only at the time of the temple. There has to be a Beis HaMikdash. And we're going to unpack this a little bit more, because why should it only be during the times of the temple? Can you bring sacrifices without a temple? Can you bring sacrifices today? Now, technically, it's a little bit problematic today because our access to the Temple Mount, or all of the Temple Mount, is impeded by other buildings that are there, or Israeli government regulations, but we're going to have to explain. It seems that the Sefer HaChinuch is making not just a contemporary statement, but is saying no temple, no sacrifice. And we're going to open that up for questioning and maybe some different views in just a few minutes. And then there's this idea of kares. There's the idea of being cut off from the Jewish people, right? We know that the Torah is not shy about presenting the punishments that exist. So we know that it talks about if a person violates the Shabbat, then they're liable in the death penalty. Or if you accidentally violate Shabbat, then you have to bring a sacrifice. Right? We know that there's always there's often deterrence that is presented in the Torah. So here, usually what happens is that if the Torah says don't do something, and you do it, there's a punishment. Usually when the Torah says do something, but you don't do it, it's harder to impose a punishment, right? Because you didn't do anything. The idea of a punishment is if you improperly do something, you get punished. But it's harder to impose a punishment if you didn't do anything, right? It's kind of like, it's one thing if you violated Shabbos by striking a match. But if you slept through lunch, you're going to be punished for not eating lunch. You didn't make kiddush. Like if you eat without making kiddush, there's an action that you did that went against the regulation. But if you just don't do anything, how is there a punishment? So usually when it comes to negative commandments, there's a punishment. But when it comes to positive commandments, there's no punishment. There's a discussion that you missed an opportunity. Or, for example, at times the rabbis might compel the individual to do what they're supposed to do. But here, if you don't bring the Korban Pesach, if you're not part of that process, remember, everyone is obligated, then you are spiritually cut off from the Jewish people. This is an exception, a rare exception, that for non-performance, you are punished. You might say that if for non-performance, you're being punished in a spiritual way, there are no physical repercussions, right? It's not that there's lashes or a death penalty or a sacrifice, right? It's kind of like this time I'll let you off with a warning. We should know that kares, the spiritually being cut off from the Jewish people, is viewed as much more serious than a warning. It's almost as bad as a death penalty.
When you say
might impact you physically, but kares impacts you spiritually. So it is unique. This commandment, the Sefer HaChinuch mentions, introduces us to two exceptions or two unique categories that we don't normally encounter. One, a positive time-bound commandment that women are also obligated in for a number of reasons. Mainly, it's so important, and there are also negative commandments they're obligated in. And here we have a punishment that you will be spiritually cut off from the Jewish people for doing nothing. But by doing nothing, you've removed yourself from participation in the Passover experience, which is one of the most important experiences that we have as Jews. And so that is mitzvah number 5. That's the mitzvah of the Korban Pesach. Where, as we move forward, there are a series of commandments relating to the eating and the preparing of the Korban Pesach, and we're going to approach them, review them briefly, but then trying and understand, like, why do we need multiple commandments relating to the Korban Pesach? Right? Why can't it just be one commandment? Sacrifice it, eat it. Why so many details? So mitzvah number 6 is a commandment to eat the meat of the Pesach sacrifice. To eat the meat of the Pesach sacrifice on the 15th night of Nisan, according to the specifications of the verse, and they shall eat the meat on this night. And is practiced by males and females. So once again, it's a positive time-bound commandment, but as we said, it's Passover related, so women are obligated. One who transgresses it has negated a positive commandment, right? We don't say here you're spiritually cut off, but you've negated a positive commandment. An important principle in the entire Torah, but anyone who says that he will negate a positive commandment is that he is coerced by a court if they have the power in their hands until he fulfills it. Right, so here the Sefer HaChinuch presents what normally happens. If there's a mitzvah to do something and you don't do something, you miss out on the opportunity, A. B, the Beit Din can force you. Now, it opens up some interesting, what does it mean the Beit Din is going to force you? Are they going to hold your nose until you open your mouth and then put the food in? It raises some interesting questions. That's it connects a little bit to our title of I hope you like lamb, right? The Paschal sacrifice is a lamb. Let's say you don't eat lamb. What's going to happen in that situation? Are we going to force you? It's with the mother and the spoon and the kid's no, and you try to stick it. What exactly is what are we expecting here? Also, what about, what will happen if a person just doesn't like something, doesn't like lamb? Person's a vegetarian, someone's vegan. So I do know that I was talking about it with someone who said, look, I'm vegetarian, but when we have a Pesach sacrifice again and I have to eat lamb, I'll eat a little piece, right? It's not I may have my dietary preferences, but if there's a commandment, right, I got to eat it. That's the rule. I have no choice in the matter. And so, how exactly the coercion would take place, there does seem to be a recognition that the Pesach sacrifice is one that we are insisting that people participate. One, it's a statement of acceptance and belief in the whole Exodus process. 2, it's an important ritual that requires participation, even if you don't like to. Now, we can encounter situations that a person is allergic, right? That's a whole different story. And there is a category in Jewish law called ones. Ones is someone is under duress. The Talmud has an expression, ones rachmana patre, which is Aramaic for if someone is under duress, Jewish law will exempt that person, will recognize that the person isn't fully liable. So if you take someone who hates lamb and refuses to eat the lamb, that's not the appropriate or that's not the ideal behavior when it comes to the Pesach sacrifice. At the same time, it's not that the person is violating to rebel against God. The person is violating because they just can't stomach the lamb. it would seem that optimally a person should try to eat. Remember, we're not talking you have to eat a whole lamb. We're talking about eating a small olive-sized piece. So we're hoping that for the fulfillment of the obligation, for the participation in the ritual which commemorates the very underpinnings of the Jewish nation, that you'll not only will you be part of the sacrifice and participate, but you will eat a small amount to show that you are part of this. You are participating in this experience. And so that is our next mitzvah. Any questions, comments, reactions? So far we've seen it's a fundamental, foundational commandment. Everyone participates, and the consequences of non-participation in the sacrifice are significant on a spiritual level. And even in the participation in the actual eating, it's for everybody. And even there, we recognize that people may need to do what they don't want to do, and we would force people to participate in this mitzvah.
And this law is for infinity?
And this what is for infinity?
Yeah, the law.
So this law, you have to eat the Korban Pesach if you have a Korban Pesach, right?
Well,
so,
the question is if we're incorporating the whole feeling of the Exodus, and that's the reason for the Korban Pesach, and we have a Seder, we should be having a Korban Pesach.
So that is why the lack of a Korban Pesach impacts the Seder in several ways. We're not talking about matzah and maror this time. We'll probably get to it in subsequent weeks. But
the real stuff.
The eating of the Pesach sacrifice can only be if you have a Pesach sacrifice. So that's why the other mitzvahs we're going to see tonight are generally viewed by the chinuch as temple dependent. You need a Beis HaMikdash. And like I said,
bottom line, without the Beis HaMikdash today in 2022, forever, without that Beis HaMikdash, we can't do those things.
So that's definitely the Sefer HaChinuch's presentation of the subject. We're going to look at the mitzvos, and we're going to come back to might there be an alternate view of Pesach sacrifice even without a temple. Now, every year there is it just makes me think about every year they have the president pardons the turkey before Thanksgiving. Every year there is a reenactment of the Paschal sacrifice service, where you have people who are Kohanim, they have a lamb, and they go through exactly the motions, and they slaughter it, and they capture the blood, right? There's something called the Third Temple Institute in Jerusalem, which has created some of the utensils that will be used in the Beis HaMikdash, and they've created the clothes that the Kohen will wear in the Beis HaMikdash. And so this ritual on Erev Pesach is a big deal for that institute, because they reenact the Korban Pesach ceremony, as going as far as slaughtering, preparing the lamb for consumption, the firing of it, the skinning of it, etc. That's a reenact. So they're going through the motions. They're certainly not saying they are bringing a Pesach sacrifice. They're doing the same things that would be done to the Pesach sacrifice, but they're not bringing it, which is actually something that we all may have seen at our Seder, because at the Seder, there comes to the part of the Seder where we invoke the idea of Pesach, matzah, maror, right? The sacrifice, the matzah, and the bitter herbs. And we point to the matzah, or we hold it up, and we point or hold up the maror. But when we say the word Pesach, we don't point or hold up anything, right? We know that on our Seder plates is a remembrance of the Pesach sacrifice. What's that? The shank bone, or the chicken, whatever bone we put on the Seder plate. So why don't we point to the bone and say that's the Korban Pesach? Because it's not. You can't point to something and say it is a sacrifice, because of the laws of sacrifices and because of the laws of holy objects. By declaring something sacred, you've now made it sacred. So we don't want you to say this is the Pesach sacrifice, because all of a sudden you've basically said this is a Pesach sacrifice. And we have no temple, and we're not in Jerusalem, and we're not following all those rules anymore. So what you've basically said is that you've sanctified something that can't apply its sanctity towards. And therefore, in a sense, this is what's called in the Talmud, me'ila. Me'ila is where you have a holy object and you remove it from its holy state and utilize it in ways that you shouldn't use it. So if you have an animal that's supposed to be given as a sacrifice, or an object that's supposed to be in the temple, and you take it out of the temple, you've violated an element of this me'ila. And so you have to be very careful not to sanctify something that by doing so would shift its permissibility only into the temple. So for example, you may also notice that before Purim, some people have the custom to take the coins. They sometimes in synagogues, they put coins in a basket, $50, machzis hashekel. This commemorates the half shekel coin that was collected to count the Jews, from which they took the funds and built the Mishkan, and later they used it for the temple. So there are those who feel that you have to make sure not to call it machzis hashekel, because if you do, then that money has to be spent on the temple. And so you may notice, and many shuls I have been at do this. I think it's the more appropriate way. They don't say this is machzis hashekel. They say zecher lamachzis hashekel. This reminds us of the machzis hashekel, because usually they want to take the funds that are raised from there and give it to charity. If it's really machzis hashekel, half shekel coins, where must it be used? Only in the temple. So therefore, you call it zecher. We're remembering the machzis hashekel. There's one other similar application of this principle, and that relates to some synagogues have a custom what's called schnuttering. You may have heard that expression. Schnuttering is a contraction of a word that, in addition to a mishaberach, we say when people get an aliyah on Shabbos, they'll say another mishaberach where the person will commit funds, and in the merit of those funds, the members of the family be blessed. So they'll mention the name of a wife or a daughter or a granddaughter, brother, sister, cousin, and it's called schnuttering because we hope that these people will be blessed bavur shenadar tzedakah lebeit hakneset, because the person has promised money to the synagogue. So shenadar, if it's said fast, is schnutter. So the practice is called schnuttering. Most congregations eliminated this practice because some find it distasteful to, bring money and, if people want to make a donation. Shouldn't be, out loud that way in the Shabbos morning, as well as the fact that if people mention names and people have large families, you can end up with 5 minutes per person of a mishaberach, and then davening takes too long. But if you look in some of the Sidurim, especially when Art Scroll became more prominent and widespread, if a person is saying Hashem should bless these people in the merit of the money that's being donated, that's a promise. What happens if the person forgets? What happens if the person changes their mind and wants to give it to another shul, or wants to give the money to a poor person instead of an institution? But you just said the money's going to the synagogue. So the similar idea, we don't want to declare something holy unless we really mean it. So they included the word bavur shenadar b'li neder. You're only promising it without a promise. So we hope that the person will, just like b'li neder, when a person says b'li neder, it's not meant to weasel out of a commitment. It's meant to that if something goes wrong, at least I won't be liable also for making a promise. So here too, by all intents and purposes, I'm going to give the money, but it's b'li neder, so there's an escape clause. Similar to this idea that we don't want our half shekel commemoration to really go to the temple. It's only a remembrance. So there is when it comes to the Pesach sacrifice, we don't commemorate the exact same way because we're dealing with Beis Hamikdash, with temple items. We're going to be treating it very seriously. But so that emerges, with regards to nowadays, if we don't have a sacrifice, we obviously invoke the Korban Pesach, but we'll never say, hey, that reminds us of the Korban Pesach, or that's the Korban Pesach, because even a whiff of sanctifying the object to the temple means you got to get it to Jerusalem, and if not, trouble. So that's mitzvah number 6. Mitzvah number 7 is for all of the chefs, or the barbecue aficionados in the room, those who like to man the grill. Because mitzvah number 7, source number 3, is to not eat the Pesach sacrifice uncooked or boiled. To not eat from the meat of the Pesach sacrifice uncooked or boiled, but rather roasted with fire, as it is stated. Do not eat of it raw or surely boiled with water, only roasted with fire. Okay, it has to be fire roasted. The law of the commandment, what is raw? What is the law if one made it as a pot roast or roasted it basted with fruit juices or water with tide oil? All the details are elucidated in Pesachim. So the Talmud here is basically a cookbook. Guess what's considered fire roasted? Can you have any other ingredients? Any liquid whatsoever? And it is practiced by males and females at the time of the temple. One who transgresses it and eats it uncooked or boiled is lashed. See, they also have men involved in the roasting process. This is where we know that men belong in the kitchen too. One who transgresses it and eats it uncooked or boiled is lashed, right? This is a negative commandment. If you do something that you're not supposed to do, then there's a punishment involved, and the punishment here is lashes. This starts off a whole conversation about a contemporary Pesach night. What kind of things can be on the menu? Some people specifically want roasted meat on the menu on the Pesach night to commemorate the roasted meat of the Korban Pesach. Some avoid all roasted meat at the Seder night because we don't want anything that even smacks of the similar cooking methods of the Korban Pesach. If you don't have a Korban Pesach, you don't have a Korban Pesach. And that's how it's understood. Here's a next commandment. And if you're starting to wonder why there's so many detailed commandments relating to the meat and how it's cooked and when it's eaten and how it's eaten, that's exactly what we're leading up to, because the chinuch is himself going to wonder, why do we need all these specific regulations as separate commandments? Number 8, not to leave from the meat of the Pesach sacrifice, to not leave from any of the meat of the Pesach sacrifice overnight. Right? This is basically the Jewish mother saying, clean your plate. You're not allowed to have any leftovers. Okay, no leftovers. Mitzvah number 13, source number 5, that we not feed of the Pesach sacrifice to an apostate Jew. Right, we not feed the Pesach to a Jew that is a habitual sinner of idolatry, as it said, no foreigner shall eat it. And the understanding is that the foreigner is a Jew whose actions have become foreign to God. Right, a foreigner. Obviously, a non-Jew is not going to be eating the Korban Pesach. The non-Jews don't celebrate Passover. So what does it mean when it says a foreigner should not eat it? Someone who is a Jew but is viewed as a foreigner because of their activities are foreign from traditional Judaism. This is, begins to make us start thinking, so does this mean, what about non-observant Jews? What about the wicked son? Right, these are all categories of reverberations from these details. Number 6, that we not feed of the sacrifice to a stranger or a resident. To not allow to eat from the meat of the Pesach sacrifice to a stranger or resident, as it is stated, the resident or wage worker shall not eat it. A resident is a man from the other nations who takes it upon himself not to worship idolatry, but eats carcasses. Meaning he doesn't worship idols, but he still doesn't eat kosher. A hired laborer is a convert who has circumcised himself, but is not yet immersed in the mikvah. And so did our sages, may their memory be blessed, explain. Right, so someone he's on his way to converting to Judaism, but he's not Jewish yet. They're not allowed to partake of the Korban Pesach. Some people are familiar with the practice. You may have heard the saying, don't have non-Jews at the Seder. This is where it comes from. I don't think that there is no prohibition against having non-Jews at the Seder. Sometimes it's a personal preference. Sometimes it's people would say, a lot of the Haggadah talks about how God poured out God's wrath against the non-Jew, and it might be a little bit uncomfortable. But here, since we're not serving the Korban Pesach to the non-Jew, it got extended as so the non-Jew's not at the Seder. Now, if you don't have a Korban Pesach at the Seder, maybe you don't have the same responsibility for the non-Jew not to be there. And last but not least, the commandments that we look at now, not to take out from the meat of the Pesach outside. You can't take it outside. You should not take it outside the house. It's a little bit strange. It's kind of, where are all these commandments coming from? So mitzvah number 8, this will be the straw that breaks the camel's back into our discussion as to the why. to not break a bone from the Pesach sacrifice, to not break from all of the bones of the Pesach, as it says, and a bone of it you shall not break. Right, so if anyone's ever eaten, chicken, you break some bones, or even you're eating steak, you break the ribs, you break a bone. Can't break a bone. So here, the Sefer HaChinuch finally takes a break, pun intended. Can't break the bones, so the Sefer HaChinuch takes a break and says, let's try and understand why there's so many details. We know there should be Korban Pesach, but why no breaking bones, no eating outside? Why being so specific about the apostate Jew or the resident and the stranger? So in the source number 8, third line down, my son, do not think to pounce upon my words and say, why would God, may he be blessed, command us to do all these commandments to commemorate that miracle? Would we not remember with one commemoration, such as that it not be forgotten from the mouth of our offspring? You must know that it is not from wisdom that you would question me about this, and it is your youthful thoughts that lead you to this. And know, my son, if you have understanding, incline your ear and hear, and I will teach you to benefit from Torah and the commandments. You must know that a man is acted upon according to his actions, and his heart and all his thoughts always follow after the actions that he does, whether good or bad. This is the Sefer HaChinuch's philosophy of mitzvos in general. Why do we have mitzvos? Why do we have actions and obligations? Because our acting will influence our thoughts, our emotions, our feelings. And even he whose heart is a complete sinner, and all the desires of his heart are only for evil. If his spirit shall be enlightened, he will put his efforts and actions to persist in Torah commandments. Even if not for the sake of heaven, he shall immediately incline towards the good. And from that which is not for the sake of, comes that which is for his own sake, as opposed to being for personal gain. For the hearts are drawn after the actions. He introduces the idea, which in Hebrew is mitoch shelo lishma balishma. You may not be doing actions for the right reasons, but at some point, the truth and the truth will sink in, and you'll start doing things for the right reasons. And even a man is perfectly righteous, heart is straight and innocent, desiring Torah commandments, he shall constantly deal with improper things. You compare to someone who was forced by the king to work a wicked craft. He can still he works in that wicked craft. Eventually, from his righteousness, he shall become completely evil. For it is known and true that every man is acted upon according to his actions. All right, it's about actions. To some extent, Judaism would be okay with the idea of fake it till you make it. You may not want to do something, but you have to do something. And we have an expression from the Talmud in Makot that God wants to grant merits to Israel. He gave them many laws and commandments. We have so many mitzvos to give us so many opportunities to connect to God, and so many actions to condition ourselves to hopefully appreciate that we're doing things for the right reasons. And you may think, what's the big deal whether it's eaten roasted or boiled? Or what's the big deal if a bone is broken or not? It is a big deal because God said so. And from here we have the idea, we encounter this, the fact that, I often speak about the tension between deed and creed, between actions and obligations on the one hand, and the religious experience and intentions on the other. And Judaism sees a synergy, a synthesis of the two. Right? I always invoke Rabbi Norman Lamb, who talks about actions, obligations are akin to the body, and the religious experience and the intention are akin to the soul. And he likes to say that a soul without a body is a ghost. It's not anchored in reality. But a body without a soul is a corpse. It's dead. So you need actions and you need obligations, but they should be infused with intention. And you need both. Now, at the end of the day, Judaism places a priority on the actions and the obligations. And the Sefer HaChinuch would say, because if you do it and you condition yourself to do it, it will become something more meaningful. People have to say the same thing about when you're trying to develop a good habit, you're trying to get into the habit of exercising, or doing other things that you don't like to do. You learn to like it, or you learn to at least appreciate it. And that's what's taking place with all these commandments. And in particular, finally, when it's the don't break the bones, that's where the Sefer HaChinuch finally says, look, I just got to explain. This is not, don't look for exclusively for deeper reasons and explanations and a philosophy for every mitzvah. There's an overarching philosophy. And remember, we're still pretty early into the explication of the 613 commandments, right? We're only up to commandment number 16. So, but here in a series of what might seem to be some tedious detail or some extraneous actions, the Sefer HaChinuch sees it fit to explain the overall philosophy, that the actions, the obligations are opportunities to draw closer to God and to develop a pattern of behavior, which might seep in to our emotions and our character as well. Now, this whole idea of the breaking of the bone, he could have given this explanation for any of the others. So what about this bone breaking? I don't know what you're visualizing, but I'm thinking of someone sucking on ribs and but the bone breaks. I don't know. It seems a very visceral image for me. And a rabbinic colleague of mine, his name is Rabbi Evan Hoffman, had a Dvar Torah on the subject where he quoted the Zohar. See, it's Sam Ophir was at some of our earlier classes, so we'll have to let him know that we quoted the Zohar tonight. And he develops an idea that maybe why the breaking of the bones stands out, and maybe that's why the Sefer HaChinuch is drawn to it as well. Source number 10. Source number 9 was one more Paschal sacrifice commandment about the uncircumcised may not eat from the Pesach sacrifice. And so you want to know, who is someone who's not circumcised? So someone who's not circumcised isn't a sinner per se. It's just interesting in source number 9. It refers to someone whose brothers have died because of circumcision. If someone's brothers died because of circumcision, then that individual is exempt from circumcision, does not get circumcised. However, that person also can't eat the Korban Pesach. It's kind of, it's not his fault. If the brothers died because of circumcision, we don't want to take the risk and circumcise him also. Back in the time, it could have been that there was hemophilia and bleeding and didn't stop. In any event, that's, an additional detail to pique our curiosity and be a source of discussion with the Paschal sacrifice. But getting back to the bones, right? So what's special, unique about the bones and the breaking of the bones? So source number 10, the Zohar offers a radically different understanding of our verse. The bones of the Paschal lamb were to remain intact because the whole skeletal structure of the animal was to be placed outside the home the next morning. Dogs would then pounce on the carcasses, break the bones, and drag them off. The Egyptians who worshiped the lamb as a manifestation of their deity would be mortified by the sacrilege. They would desperately attempt to collect the strewn bones and bury them out of canine reach. Accordingly, the provocative, unbroken bone of the Paschal lamb must be seen as a rare exception. As tormentors of the Israelites, the Egyptians deserve the plagues that befell them. They believe their deities to be more powerful than the God of Israel and countenanced our ancestors' enslavement. This made nullification of their gods an essential component of the Exodus story. In that hour of divinely wrought salvation, when God rescued the Hebrews from a nation that knew him not, it was necessary and appropriate to cast aside the usual inhibitions and to treat false belief with disdain. He sees it based on the Zohar as a thumb in the eye, right? Our God isn't God, your God is God. Well, look at this. Here's what's left of your God, the bones from the carcass that the dogs are running away with. It's generally speaking, we're not the type that believes in revenge, but this experience of the plagues and the Korban Pesach in the Exodus included a reminder of how essential it was for God to make himself known to the Egyptians as well. And if, in addition to the technical obligation, there's a historical reminder of sometimes it's important to have a little Jewish pride in that the Jewish God is the true God and the false gods are not God. I always like to say the movie The Ten Commandments often has great filters to understand the story. And at the end of the splitting of the sea, finally Pharaoh says, "Their God is God," and that's what the Zohar might be saying about keeping the skeleton intact as a proof that the Egyptian God is not God, and our God is God. Just wanted to finish because we had spoken about, Elliot asked earlier on, what about sacrifices today and there's no temple? So it's very clear that the Chinuch is saying that these commandments only apply in temple times, seemingly because no temple, no sacrifice, right? So that doesn't seem to necessarily be agreed upon by all, right? And the Mishnah in Ediot, source number 11, mentions that Rabbi Joshua said, "I've heard that sacrifices may be offered even though there is no temple." And there seems to be the possibility that several centuries past the destruction, you could bring sacrifices. There's no temple, but we know where the Temple Mount is. And there are a lot of hoops to jump through, but if you know if you can figure out where the altar is and you can know what to do and you have the materials, it would seem that based on Rabbi Joshua's testimony, it's not necessarily 100% critical that you need a temple to bring a sacrifice. You need a lot of knowledge and a lot of expertise and procedures, maybe, but you may not need a temple. Now, it could be that the Chinuch would never have thought about anything like this because there is no temple. He would have found the whole thing ridiculous, and maybe Rabbi Joshua's testimony was a bygone era, and in contemporary times it can never happen. But maybe, things went a little bit more, lasted a little bit longer. Source number 12, the Secret History of Procopius, who was a Byzantine historian in the 6th century, quotes that the Emperor Justinian exerted himself to destroy the traditions of the Jews. For whenever it's in their calendar Passover came before the Christian Easter, he forbade the Jews to celebrate on their proper day, to make then any sacrifices to God or perform any of their customs. Many of them were heavily fined by the magistrates for eating lamb at such times, as if this were against the laws of the state. So Procopius implies that the Jews were performing sacrifices. Now, he could have meant the ritual. It could have meant they had lamb. It's not. There's no proof that sacrifices were being brought by Jews in the 6th century. But there seems to be there's an allusion to the concept, and that would be in line with Rabbi Yehoshua. Rabbi Yehoshua, usually the Tanaim period ended around the year 200. And Procopius is talking about Justinian in the 6th century, a couple hundred years later. Were there still efforts? We mentioned even today the reenactment of the temple. Well, of the sacrifice. Well, maybe if there was no mosque on the Temple Mount, right, like in the 6th century, maybe it was possible to have sacrifices still brought in that place, by those who knew how to do it and the like. So, this was something that continued to be revisited. There are different allusions, people talking about wanting to bring sacrifice in the Middle Ages. Really in the 19th century, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, who had, was trained in the yeshivos of Eastern Europe, Rabbi Akiva Eger, was a rabbi in Germany. He was one of the first Zionists, right? The Zionism of Herzl at the turn of the 20th century was preceded by some religious Zionist leanings by the Chovevei Tzion, they were called. Rabbi Kalischer was a leader, advocate for that. And he published a book saying that sacrifices should be brought in his time. We should go back to Israel, we should bring sacrifices. So in the 19th century, you have advocating for sacrifices in contemporary times. It was generally rejected. It was viewed as a more minority opinion, and it never came to fruition. But it does seem that even though the Sefer HaChinuch is saying only during the times of the temple, sacrifices may not require a temple. Maybe they didn't require a temple. Maybe they require a temple for so long. And some would even say that even today, without a temple, we should have sacrifices. Just wanted to conclude that even if we don't have sacrifices, we have, of course, prayer and Avot Rabbi Natan, number 4, source 13. On one occasion, when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his disciple Rabbi Shua were leaving Jerusalem, they gazed upon the destroyed temple and cried out, "Woe to us! The place where Israel obtained atonement for sins is in ruins." Rabbi Yochanan said to him, "My son, be not distressed. We still have an opportunity. Atonement equally efficacious, and that is the practice of benevolence. We still have other actions of chesed and kindness that can stand in for sacrifices." Definitely not going to taste as good as fire roasted lamb, but we've seen a number of the commandments connected to the Korban Pesach, in addition to which the idea of so many details providing us with a springboard to a philosophy of commandments that behavior is meant to hopefully set us on the right path and influence our emotional and religious leanings. Specifically, this idea of not breaking a bone can also be a very important exclamation point on the Exodus in God's dominion. And the idea of maybe we still could have sacrifices today, according to some opinions, even without a temple. We'll move further along in the Sefer HaChinuch in upcoming classes.